so unfair. Maybe for me it would be okay, but for you, Robin, the world was so different for women, and especially if can you imagine being a black woman back then? Oh my gosh. Right. So the one thing is, let's sometimes remember that things are getting better little by little, and you know why they're getting better? Because you have people who step up to the plate, like Martin Luther King Jr., and make a huge difference. And for you ladies, some of the people who we call suffragettes and feminists, they're the ones who have made a big difference for you, and for all of us. My gosh, I love my mother. Right? Mm-hmm. I wanted the world to be good for her. I love my daughter. I want the world to be good for her. Right? Mm-hmm. Of course. Alida Brill is on the phone, and her credentials say she is a feminist social critic. Wow. I wonder if it says that on the business card. She's an advocate for women's rights, as I think all of us are, or should be anyway. She's a co-convener of the Women's Dialogue US-USSR. You guys are going to see, you and your mom are going to see a movie about Russia tomorrow, right?
Yes, we are. Yep.
She served on the board of the Feminist Press of the City University of New York, and her book is called Dear Princess Grace, Dear Betty, the memoir of a romantic feminist. A romantic feminist. I like that. Alida Brill, the 50th anniversary of the National Organization of Women, by the way, is part of what we're talking about. Good morning, Alida. How are you?
Good morning, Larry and Robin. It's so nice to be back on your show with this book.
And where are you calling from?
Oh, New York City.
Yes.
The middle of it all.
That's right.
The middle of the middle of it all.
I love New York City.
Yeah.
I have been to Ocala, and so I know its beauties and expanse. That is something, as I stare out my living room window, I do not have. I'm looking for sky, Larry. I'm looking for sky.
Well, if you're living in New York City, Central Park has expanse. And anything outside of New York City has expanse. Dear. Yes.
Yeah, but you could fit New York Central Park into one tiny corner of Ocala, my dear. But none of us move to New York for the weather, or most of us for the views, unless you're in one of the lofty penthouses with the wealthy. I'm so very glad to be back with you, and indeed this is the 50th anniversary of the founding of the National Organization for Women, and Betty Friedan was its first president.
Is that right? Oh, and I didn't know. Now tell me about her. Tell me about Betty Friedan.
Well, Betty Friedan, who is part of the title of the book, and in fact her picture is on the cover of the book. Betty Friedan was a disgruntled, unhappy, well-educated, smart, wise housewife who realized she was not happy and didn't know why, but she was supposed to be happy, and she knew she was supposed to be happy. And she went to her Smith College reunion, and she was asked, because she was a magazine journalist, to do a little survey, questionnaire of her sister graduates. And they were all writing essentially the same thing she was feeling, a dissatisfaction with their lives, and they didn't know what was the matter with them. She also picked up that some of her classmates were drinking too much and were depressed and gaining weight and all those sort of symptoms that are telltale signs of misery. And she realized that she was not alone, and so she famously went back to her kitchen table, let the dishes pile up in her sink, and began to write the classic book, The Feminine Mystique, which, when published in 1963, was a tsunami. It was not the pebble in the pond, it was the tsunami, and it changed forever. It upended, really, Robin and Larry, the way we are as men and women together inside our homes and in the workplace.
As in most social changes, if we make a law that says we must do something or we must not do something anymore, that's maybe the beginning of it. But it takes, I think, a social architect, if I can use that expression, to change our minds about things and to open our eyes about how maybe we could improve things for everybody else.
Couldn't agree more. And I think the thing I always love to say about Friedan, who when I was 30 years old became such a close friend of mine that she really became a second mother to me.
Oh, wow.
Friedan dedicates The Feminine Mystique, which was published when I was still a girl, to all the new women, ... and to the new men. And that's what I always like to remind everyone, and that's what my book is about. It is about romance and love and the dilemma of being both a feminist and a woman who loves men, and Betty certainly loved men. Betty saw that if we were to have a movement for equality for women, not superiority, but equality for women, men had to be part of that conversation, because part of what she observed from her perch in a fairly well-heeled suburb is that the men all around her were drinking too much, working too hard, having heart attacks, having other physical and emotional issues, because in that post-war moment, which we were still in '63, of course the book was published before JFK was killed, but that didn't change the domestic thing, it changed the national thing. She saw that men were suffering too from this only women are working problem. And so she named it the problem that had no name. My own beloved mother said, oh, this problem has a name. It's called boredom and housework. And she read the book. My mother read the book when it first came out, and it became a Bible to my mother. And it changed her life forever and my father's life, because my mother finally went back to work.
Were the conditions that were needing to be addressed the same or worse in other countries?
I think that the conditions were different. I always like to say, I don't know what it's like to live in another country, because more or less I haven't. I have lived mostly in this country. I know about this country, and I don't pretend to know about other countries. What I know is that within our country, of course, there are different countries. African American women have always worked. And one of the criticisms that Friedan suffered from when the book was published was, it's a white woman's perspective. She never said it wasn't, and that's one of the things that I talk about in the book. She understood that she needed to write from what she knew. Always a good place to start, unless you're a researcher.
Sure, yeah.
Start from what you know, and then move forward. So I don't know that, although I have met African American women on the book tour trails, that they responded to the feminine mystique, because although that they understood it was written not for them, they were also, despite working outside the home and working inside the home, they were also trapped in this romantic dilemma of wanting still to appear beautiful and competent and sexy for their men. And so the whole notion of how we unpack, if you will, these disparate things inside a woman, which is, if you're a heterosexual, to try to make men happy, to try to make them The Good Wife, there's a good example, that television show, to try to make it work, to make the relationship work, the marriage work, and yet at the same time have an identity, have a place in the world and in the workplace and at home that is uniquely yours. And I say in the book, I had a wonderful experience where I did a book reading on the Upper West Side here in New York, and a woman came up to me and she said, I've read your book, but would you sign it, because I just bought another one for my daughter. Actually, this is a series of interlocking love stories. And I said, well, I suppose it is. I fell in love with Princess Grace when I was 6, wrote her a letter, asked her to please send me a stamp, and that I hoped she would be happy forever and ever and ever. So the need to be chosen, you see, the need to be chosen, the deep in us, because it's so, it's so entrenched. I don't know if, Robin, if you feel this, but the need to be chosen and the whole romance bit, whether it's the Bachelor, whatever, it's so entrenched in our culture.
It is. There was something in the news, I guess, how long ago was Frozen out, the movie Frozen by Disney?
About 3 years ago,
Yeah.
I think.
So when that first came out, there was a lot made about the fact that the two girls who are the stars, they're not real people, but they're characters. They don't happily ever after doesn't end at the movie with them finding a prince and driving off into the sunset.
No.
And
That's right.
And I thought that was an interesting thing that Disney chose to intentionally do.
Which I thought was, it's interesting that, as you say, they weren't real characters. It's interesting that was the vehicle, but nonetheless, it's out there, isn't it? Another view is out there.
Well, and a lot of times, a little girl playing with a little doll. One of the things that I've often thought was just unfair is in this business, in the broadcasting business, not so much in radio, but in TV, how an old guy can keep broadcasting and broadcasting and broadcasting, but as soon as the woman has a wrinkle,
Yeah.
she's replaced by somebody.
Right.
I mean, look what.
Or she has, or even more horrifying, she has plastic surgery to the point you don't really remember who that was. Oh, was that so-and-so? Because the plastic surgery, now such extreme plastic surgery, I'm not convinced that the women on air want to have their faces lifted off their faces and put back on and clipped so that they sort of look like maybe somebody you once knew, but they know that to be competitive, they have to play that game. And I think it goes to politics as well. I don't want to get too political because I think women's rights are here to stay. Campaigns come and go. But I found it interesting that even a terrifically feminist friend of mine, a wonderful man, a wonderful feminist man, we happened to be watching the news together, and Elizabeth Warren was on the road with Hillary Clinton. Do you remember that first appearance they made together?
Oh, no. Do you, Robin?
And they were both in blue. They were both in blue jackets.
Yeah.
And this friend of mine, who truly has feminist credentials, no kidding, he said, "Oh my God, did they both have to wear the same color?" And I looked at him and I said, "Pardon me, if it were two men, aren't they always in dark suits with either blue or red ties?"
And what he showed you.
You don't see it. You don't see it.
Yeah, what he showed you was
when it's with women.
And I think what you're saying and what that demonstrates, and it's probably true for me too, is it's socially ingrained. It happens without us even realizing it.
And what I call it is innocent and inherent sexism. Now, my more radical feminist friends go, "There's nothing innocent about sexism," but actually, because it's, as you say, Larry, so much a part of our culture, it's so ingrained that it's not pernicious. It's not intended to be vicious. I've heard and experienced vicious sexism. Of course, I think all women have. I'm sure you have too, Robin. But it's kind of a thoughtless sexism because that's, and I will honestly tell you, when they first came on the screen, I thought, ooh, did nobody talk to them about what they were wearing? And I think that's hilarious that even for me, that crossed my mind.
Yeah.
We've got a long way to go, there's no question, but I also think that we are so far from where we were.
Yes.
But I also think you still using that as an example that was totally orchestrated, because sometimes women
I do too.
like to be the dominant factor, and that they forget about equality and being feminine and the beauty part. They want to be the dominant one and run the show, and thereby giving other women the B word, which isn't good.
Exactly, which isn't good. Of course, the young women, the young feminists are a whole different story and a whole different game, and I'm fascinated by them. I'm a bit terrified of them, actually. I think it's good for older people to be terrified by younger people, but
I think so. They're the movers.
They want to reclaim words that give me the chills. In fact, there's a magazine. I think it's having its 10th anniversary called Bitch. It's a magazine called Bitch, and I'm thinking, whoa!
Really?
For them, they reclaimed it. You know, they're up in Portland. They reclaimed it, and that's their form of radicalism. They use words, and of course, there's this whole movement called slut walks. I'm sure you're familiar with it. They want to reclaim. You want to call us sluts, and that's why we're getting raped. Well, I'll show you. We're going to call ourselves that. You know, and it's kind of in your face. Well, you know, for an old feminist like myself, who was a young feminist for a very long time, and now most of the mothers have left me. They've moved on to the next galaxy. You know, we fought so hard for those words to be removed.
I know. Well, it's like a civil rights activist must go nuts hearing the N-word in all these new songs.
Exactly. Right. And people are embracing it.
Yes, and these young activists that are saying, that's our word, we own it. Well, I would like nobody to own the words that I just said.
Right.
But I also know that in my moment, and I came of age as a feminist, of course, quite post-Friedan. I was just my good luck that when I moved to New York at 30, she became my close friend. But I remember how we were determined not to accept the mothers being Friedan and Steinem to a lesser extent, but Steinem as well. So we were trying to make our movement too, but you know, there was so much work to do. We didn't have equality in anything. I mean, look at the sports situation.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, if you wanted to swim for your high school, you had to get to the school pool by 6 a.m. so the pool could be cleared for the boys and the water polo team, because you didn't exist. There weren't sports opportunities. And that alone, and I think especially Ocala, which is such a fabulously sporty town, I mean, the equestrian life there in your wonderful place. I mean, just look at athletic life for women now and then.
Wow.
Billie Jean King was the only game in town, right?
Mm-hmm.
In our town? I don't know. Do you know, in our town, I've recently been healed by a lady doctor who is the only doctor, I think, in our town, right, Robin? Who heals wounds. She's like a wound heal specialist.
Yeah.
And she's the only one. She's the only one we have. And when you first hear her name, you say, Doctor, what's her last name?
Joviak.
Joviak. Dr. Joviak. Wonderful doctor. Thank you, doctor. You took care of me for the last few months. But you hear the name and you think you're going to meet a man. And it's just,
right.
It's a mental thing. We don't even think.
It is a mental thing. You know, my last book that you were so kind to me and gave me such a wonderful boost with that book, Dancing at the River's Edge, Patient and Her Doctor Negotiate Life with Chronic Illness. In that book, I chronicle how partially my feminism derived, and this book is really a sequel to that one, how my feminism derived partially from the fact that here I was, this chronically ill kid with rheumatic disease, and every single doctor was a male and old enough to be my father or my grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in my lifetime now, most of the rheumatology, my God, most of the rheumatologists are women. And my own beloved doctor that I wrote the last book with has retired. He's still extremely healthy, but he retired top of his game, good for him. And his successor, and the person that he trained completely from the jump, from when she was a medical school pup, if you will, is a woman, wait for it, young enough to be my daughter. And
Wow.
I think, well, you know, I didn't lose this disease. This disease has come right along with me. You know, I always celebrate my birthday and my birthday, the birthday of my disease. You know, they're my pals. I never dreamed two things: that I would live long enough to be as old as I am, and two, that I would live long enough to see women as major docs in such a complicated field as rheumatology. That may not mean that everything is dandy for women all over this country, and to say nothing of in the world, we've got all kinds of bad stuff
Well,
going.
and that's important to point out.
But it's something big.
And I think that's important to point out because while we have a way to go, and I don't think anybody would deny that, I think we're doing pretty good in this country. I don't know how we fare up against Australia and England and France. I don't know if they're doing as good as us or not. But I mean, it's clear in the Middle East countries, with the exception of Israel, I would guess, right there, it's horrible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look at Saudi Arabia, which is a fairly advanced society. I mean, in fairness, Saudi Arabia is a fairly advanced society. I'm not trying to trash them, but you know that the feminists in Saudi Arabia have what they call drive-ins, where they're not allowed to drive. And so every once in a while, the women, and there is an active feminist consciousness there, and political leaders, they have what's called a drive-in, and they go and they drive. Now, mostly they're not
Really?
arrested.
They just get in a car?
Wow.
And, you know, and the women, the feminist friends of mine who are very involved in the international scene always try to support them. But, you know, they can't even drive, you know. So let's remember that, to say nothing of what goes on in the subcontinent, in Africa as well, you know, the honor killings, the sex slavery, and all of that. I think if I can strike a downbeat note, which I'm not inclined to do, especially since last week was such a down week for us in this country, and the world is not exactly in top shape at the moment. I think the thing, not to add to a dismal chord, but I do think the thing we need to work on, especially that I hope men, again, for all the new women and the new men, is that fathers and brothers will work more with their sons and other sibs on the rape issue. Women are getting raped, and it's not just that it's being reported more, it's that women are getting raped.
Well, and if I could add my 2 cents to that, I'm not an expert on the subject, but, you know, we grew up with Playboy magazine and Penthouse magazine, and we were taught indirectly that women are sex objects, and all this fake stuff that we were taught. And whether you want to admit it or not, most men did look at that stuff and were influenced by it. And we were harmed. Our view of women was not the same as our view of our mother and our sister. There was two different women. There were women we knew and women we wanted. You know?
Exactly. There were women you knew and cherished, and there were women that,
Right.
you know, blah, blah. And what I think needs to happen is there needs to be more education with fathers and brothers, and that, you know, look, every woman could be, you know, everyone. What is that wonderful? I think, is it Hindu where they, you know, the men that wear little masks over their faces because every life is sacred. You know, even a flea could have been your mother. You know, everyone is. So that whole notion of the sanctity of life, so that you approach every woman in your mind as possibly your mother or your sister.
Everyone is
or
somebody's
your daughter. Or
Everyone is
your daughter.
That's right.
And, you know, we just come out of this bad rape thing, and the father was so angry, the swimmer, the Stanford guy, and what his father said, I thought, no, be sad that your son has ruined his career.
That's right.
Exactly.
Do not rail against a judge that is trying to punish him appropriately. And of course, you know, he wasn't that bad a sentence, except that he did, in fact, torpedo his career.
The letter
For
that
what?
the young girl
For
wrote.
what?
That letter
For
the young
what?
girl wrote, and that Vice President Biden responded to. Remember that?
Right. Yes.
That was,
that was
powerful,
huge news.
powerful stuff, and that's the stuff that
But
changes.
also, and I don't want to sound like some 50s throwback. I really don't. I don't want to be drummed out of the feminist core at this point in my life. But I also feel I don't want to go back to that time when I grew up. You know, my father always said, you know, never do this, never do that, you know, because, you know, men can't be trusted. Well, you know, I always
Nobody
feel
can be
well, men are
trusted.
Not even women.
men aren't, you know, I used to say, well,
Alida-
men aren't attack dogs.
Alida
But you know what? We've got to get girls to stop drinking so much.
Alida,
Exactly,
you are
and using
awesome.
their feminine wiles.
I love having intelligent conversations with you, Alida. You're such a great guest. Thank you for being on the air with us.
You're such a great host.
I've got 9 seconds. The book is called Dear Princess Grace, Dear Betty, Alida Brill. Thank you so much for being on the air. Go to alidabrill.com. We've got to take a break, and we will be right back.
Fox News Radio, I'm Lillian Wu. Donald Trump could be getting ready to name a running mate.
It's a process that's normally shrouded in secrecy, but Trump breaking the mold again, doing it very publicly. One week, he's out on the campaign trail with Newt Gingrich. The next week, it's Chris Christie. Last night, it was Mike Pence who got his moment to audition.
Fox's John Roberts. Hillary Clinton appearing in Springfield, Illinois, in the old State House where Abraham Lincoln delivered his House Divided speech. She'll talk about the importance of uniting the country. And former NBA star Lamar Odom, one of the top trending topics on Twitter after reports he got kicked off a Delta flight.
Witnesses tell TMZ the 36-year-old former Laker was throwing back beers and shots in the Delta Lounge at LAX before boarding Monday night, then got sick on the plane. Several first